I am so delighted to be able to have this session this morning as a way of concluding the series that we've been doing this year on democracy and education. Maggie Haberman needs no introduction to this audience, but I will give a very brief one. Class of 1996 at Sarah Lawrence, the key point of her biography, no. And a White House correspondent for the New York Times, political analyst for CNN. She's part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for reporting on Donald Trump's advisors and their connections to Russia. In April, Maggie also received the Aldo Beckman Award from the White House Correspondents Association for her coverage of the White House. Before she joined the Times in 2015 as a campaign correspondent, Maggie worked as a political reporter at Politico. She previously worked also at the New York Post and the New York Daily News. Singing is among Maggie's hobbies. If you've seen The Fourth Estate, you heard the Scaramouche bit. She is also married with 3 children, and because she's from Sarah Lawrence, she lives in Brooklyn. And I'm delighted to introduce a very special guest today. Maggie's daughter, Mary, is here with her. So thank you, Mary. So we are going to spend a little time in conversation. I have to say, when Maggie and I first talked about doing this and said, well, we'll do a Q&A, and it ended up that I was going to be the interviewer. It was the day after Maggie had been with Seth Meyers, and I thought, okay, I have a bar now that is one no college president should hope for. But what we'll do is be in conversation for about a half an hour, and then we'll open up to Q&A with the audience. Maggie very graciously has offered that. So I thought we might start, Maggie. I know that you are juggling so many things, right? Life as a soccer mom, life as a correspondent, as a Sarah Lawrence alumna, and all kinds of things that we don't know about. So I thought we might kick off with sort of talk to us about a day in the life of Maggie Haberman, you know?
First of all, thank you for having me. This is the first reunion weekend that I've been to since I graduated. So, and it's unfortunately dispelling this image of myself in my head that I have that I'm still 30. I'm not. But it depends on look, every day begins at some point around 6:30 and runs until about midnight, 1 a.m. I would say that in terms of work, the pace has actually slowed a little bit because it's become a little more predictable and because there are really only a couple of key policy areas that the administration is focused on, right? So one is dismantling Obamacare, one is immigration, and specifically DACA and what's happening in court actions, and then one is trade, which I think is going to be the most important issue, barring whatever Trump comes back from North Korea or from Singapore with, is going to be the most important issue that the administration deals with this year because it's so geopolitically sensitive. So every day is some juggle of taking my kids to school. If I'm in Washington, my husband takes them to school, then going to work, and just beginning this sort of series of rolling conversations with people. For those of you who have children, you know, when you have a newborn, it's sort of like the long day that doesn't end. That's basically what this is like.
So some of us, some college president's life is a little like that, but you know, you passed me. Some of us have had the chance to see some of the first episodes of The Fourth Estate, and those of you who haven't should do. And last night I was not at Cabaret for a variety of reasons, but one of which was I realized that episode 3 and 4 were there, so I binge watched that last night for today.
You're a glutton for punishment.
How do you think about this, the place that you're now in as a White House correspondent who also is juggling when you become the story, or when the media becomes the story, or the immediacy and the look-backs, and especially now as this documentary is rolling out?
It fundamentally cuts against everything that I was trained as a reporter, that what we do. So it was incredibly uncomfortable having cameras on us. And I understand why the editors agreed to it. I mean, there's two things. One is that in terms of us becoming the story, Trump has this habit of making everyone around him, whether people who are actually working for him or just people who are sort of in the vicinity of, making them well known. And it isn't really your choice, it's just what happens. So when the President of the United States is hitting you by name on Twitter, you will become part of the story, which is not comfortable. And he's hit me a bunch of times personally, he's hit the Times specifically, frequently. The other thing about it though, and this part we chose to do, the newspaper chose to do, but I understand the choice. 2016 really taught me how few people actually understand what journalists do. And I mean news reporters. I don't mean sort of the broader rubric of journalism. And I think particularly when we have a president who yells fake news all the time and demonizes routine process, there was a desire to show how we do our jobs and how hard we try to get it right. There is a lot in that documentary that I wish cameras had not been around for. At the end of the day, I think that it showed that we are trying to be fair. A bunch of people have said to me, this humanizes you. We're not politicians. Like, that's not what, okay. But I think to the extent that so much of the discourse is about demonizing someone else, I guess that is where that's helpful.
But so as, there's a moment in the documentary when you comment on your sort of shift as a, in terms of Twitter, tweeting, where you are with that, where you thought you were 2 years ago. And talk to us a little bit about that and how you're thinking about what it is to be a journalist in the middle of
in this digital moment. So, I mean, what Twitter did, 2012 was the first news cycle where Twitter, a campaign cycle where Twitter was really used, both by reporters across the board and by campaigns. And I remember, I mean, I was like the biggest old lady Twitter scold of the younger reporters at the time, because people were, the embeds on the campaign, the young reporters from news outlets who travel literally on every stop with the candidates, which is not a role I've ever had. They would be posting pictures of themselves at events on Twitter, and these are news platforms fundamentally. I think that what Twitter has done is it has denigrated the sense that news outlets have traditionally had of institution over individual. And I don't know that that's a good thing, the way it's gone. It has also just sped up the metabolism enormously. Right. People basically read the headline and the top 3 graphs. For years, that's been a problem, and now it's like they just read the tweet, and that shapes an opinion. So I think that it's reminding ourselves to slow down. I'm not a good Twitter user. I tweet a lot, but mostly I do retweets. I tend to need a few go-arounds in conversation to kind of form my thought, and Twitter doesn't really let you do that. So I just think that I had a breakfast a couple of weeks ago with a Democratic strategist who I've known for years, and I was just catching up with this person about the state of the midterms. And this person was reminding me that they had urged me and other reporters in 2016 not to tweet so much. And their point was, you're just creating an evidence trail for people who want to paint a certain picture of you, however skewed that is. And it's really good advice, and not advice that any of us heed enough. So, but it is also hard to get off of that train because a lot of the conversation takes place there now. It's just that it's pretty disconnected from the broader national conversation.
And in that way, and you mentioned this just a moment ago, that the individual identity versus the institution, the place of the reporter but being called out, and there are ways in which President Trump does seem to think of you sometimes as the embodiment of the New York Times, that Maggie Haberman is you're it, which must occasionally feel good, but probably not, right? So how do you know, as it's become so personalized in that kind of way, and with the denial of access, but the fact that clearly, I mean, there's a moment I'll be curious how you think about the moment in the documentary again where you're taking a phone call from the president who has denied that. So how do you navigate that personality and what's it like to have people think that you are in some ways the sort of Trump whisperer, right? There are the moments who say, right? And both sides.
I mean, that label, like the hair on the back of my neck
I
stands
know,
up
and
anytime somebody says that.
I did say some people think of, right? I just wanted
That's a Trumpism. Many people are saying. No, but it's no, it is true. It is true that some people have said this, but I think it's only because they know that I have had some kind of back and forth with him over the years. So I guess a couple things. He doesn't really have relationships the way that you and I would think of them. Everything. This is what happens too when you talk about Trump, is that people think you're trying to be funny and you're not. You're just actually talking about what's going on. Everything is transactional. The nature of every relationship is a transaction with him. He's what Wall Street guys would call a deals guy. Everything is all about the deal, and so, and he views everything as what he is going to get out of it. His fundamental understanding of journalism is completely steeped in gossip pages and business pages of the New York tabloids in the 80s in New York. And his view of government comes from being a real estate developer for whom laws and regulations were obstacles to be removed, right? If you needed to get a permit through, you go see, XYZ in the borough president's office, and you try to make it happen and grease a wheel, and he emerged from this clubhouse political milieu. It's not unusual for a politician to associate the face they know best with a news outlet. I mean, pretty much every politician does that, but he more than most, and his others in his administration do it as well, attribute blame for or responsibility or fault for every story that runs in the newspaper to me. He was like this in the campaign with the person for NBC or the person for ABC, so it's not new, but he's the only person who has ever used his platform to publicly elevate it this way. And one of the things that's so strange with him, I had an interesting conversation with a former advisor to him about this the other day, but no other president has treated the media like their peers the way he does. And that really is a lot of what he does. And this person said to me, well, he was part of the media for a really long time. And I sort of thought about it, and in his mind, he was, because he would show up on the Fox and Friends couch as a commentator. He was a green room denizen. He spent a lot of time being interviewed by reporters. He loved playing the media game. In his mind, this is his area. So I just don't think he fundamentally gets what a government-dedicated press corps does, and that has been a huge struggle.
So let's step back to a comment you made earlier about where you see the policy issues going with healthcare, with immigration. This year, as you know, at the college, we were talking about democracy in education in all kinds of ways, and exactly those pieces were the intersection for us. DACA and is a really challenging issue on campuses. How we think about healthcare, how we think about access and all of that. And so from your vantage point, not just at this moment, but as a White House correspondent, how do you think about that phrase, democracy in education, and where we are in this moment, right? So both stepping outside, but also what does it mean to you right now to talk about democracy in education?
Sure. I mean, certainly at the university level or the college level, I think the most important thing that can be done is this is going to sound trite, but I cannot tell you the number of people who I graduated with who could not tell you basics about the way government works, or could not tell you basics about the way the news media works. And so the most fundamental thing that I think that schools can do right now is educate about what people. There is a sense of there is a lax reaction to both. There's a lax reaction to the erosion of institutions and trust in institutions, and there seems to be a misunderstanding about the limits of these institutions. So, for instance, a lot of the anger that gets directed at the media, particularly from the left, is, I think, because people are very angry, and they are understandably angry and scared, but there's only one entity that has a mandate, which is to be a hearings-based check on executive power with subpoena power, and that is Congress. That is not journalism. And in order for us to be believed going forward and to restore trust, because we have had an erosion of trust as well, it is vital that we are not seen as taking one side or another. So I think there's two things. I mean, I think one is educating people in, shoot, sorry.
It's your lifeline.
In how, yeah, I can't not have it. It drives my daughter crazy. How democracy actually works, what the limits of what a government body can do, and also news literacy is vital. I mean, when you have seen this sort of, the institutions that used to take precedence over the individuals in journalism, there were fewer of them. And so there were just sort of these news sources that you knew what they were. Now, because of the internet, and then Twitter puts even a finer point on it, everything looks the same. The thing that used to drive me crazy about Twitter when I started using it, I said it to a colleague of mine, was that everything is sort of shrunken down to the same size. And Trump actually takes advantage of that, right? Like in a newspaper, you can see from the placement how significant the news outlet thinks the story is. It's clearly marked opinion. On the web, it's much harder to tell. So what I really think is important is, you know, there's a nonprofit called the News Literacy Project, and I think they have done really, really important work. And I think whether it's through them or something modeled similarly, I think that is the most important thing that schools can do right now, is teach people how to be better participants and consumers.
Thank you.
But really about participants. I mean, it's not, participating is not writing an angry blog post. That's something, but that's not, that's going to increase the tribalism and not necessarily help tone it down.
And part of what, as some people heard us say, that we're doing next year as we continue with democracy and education is that some people, thank you, can tell who's experienced with the mic and who's not, as we continue with democracy and education, we're moving the series into something we're calling difference in dialogue. And I think one of the things at this moment that's related to that, and Maggie, there was a place in an interview that you talked about Trump's words fomenting anger, separation, hate, not creating the political divide, but exacerbating it. And certainly that plays out on college campuses in the kinds of ways that we're perceived beyond the campus and so on. So how do you think about those challenges playing out beyond journalism, beyond campuses? The surprise of the election, right? There's the moment you said you thought you promised your family you'd be back after the campaign.
You know, I did that, but I also had many moments during the year where I thought Hillary Clinton was going to lose.
Right.
And I said this to my colleagues, and I was told I was wrong. So I guess I'll answer it this way, which might not be, because I don't have a perfect answer for that question. I don't even have a fully formed answer for that question. The statement of it about what Trump does, I mean, that's not questionable. I've never seen a president before, Nixon, I guess, would be the only other example, who does, and he never did it like this. I mean, Trump does nothing to expand his base. His strategy is holding his base at the risk of alienating other people. And it's important to remember that, you know, he got elected on a plurality. If he runs again, let's say the Mueller probe shows nothing. Let's say the Michael Cohen probe shows nothing. If he were to run again in 2020 and the status quo is as it is now and the economy is as it is now, throw in one or two third-party candidates in a handful of states and Donald Trump is the president again. So I don't think people understand that. And that's really important to get. I'm sorry if that's not what you want to hear, but not wanting to hear it is part of the problem, if I can be candid with you. Like, this is, not wanting to hear it and then hissing and booing, I'm not saying you are, but that's sort of what ends up happening, is part of the problem. Not wanting to hear it is what happened in 2016. When I got out of Sarah Lawrence, I could not get a job in a magazine, which is what I wanted to do. And I mean, by magazines, I'm not talking Time and Newsweek. It was, you know, Allure and things like that. And so I was bartending to pay my rent because I was living off campus at that point, and in Manhattan. And My mother, who has worked around news for a very long time, had a friend at the New York Post, and there was a clerking job available, copy kid, which is about as glamorous as it sounds. But you got to be a reporter a day for 1 day a week. I had never been to Queens beyond going to the airport before I took that job, and I grew up in New York City. I had never been to the Bronx other than going to Yankee Stadium, and my father is from the Bronx. I had never been to Staten Island until I went out to cover assignments. The cloistered nature of how people, particularly on elite campuses, go about life and then enter life after college is a problem. If you don't ever meet people who are not like you, and all you hear is demonization that exists right now, you're not even going to try. So the most important thing that can happen is trying to educate people in frankly, what the rest of the country is like, what other people who are not like you of similar beliefs are like, and that people are not necessarily operating in bad faith just because they don't agree with you. And that, to me, is the most vital.
And we'll find the moment for you to come back when students are here to hear that as well, because
I suspect it will be met with more groans and boos, just based on past
But we've had one of the terrific privileges, again, as president this year, has been meeting so many alums, and one of our graduates, Kaya Stevens, who runs the Arts and Education program in prisons in Alabama, came and said, some of you will say I'm complicit because I'm working with mass incarceration. It's complicated. Let's talk about how you know really what the other side is and how you humanize that. And so we really want to be a place that is fostering that kind of space for dialogue and preparing people for it. So you mentioned bartending, or just after, but it's been 22 years since you left Sarah Lawrence. There are people here for whom it's been 65 years, so 22 feels right. Feels it's just in space. So take a moment, look back on your Sarah Lawrence education. I know your Don Belobrodsky is here, but looking back on your Sarah Lawrence education and thinking a bit about how it has figured in your work and life post Sarah Lawrence.
I was telling Bella at her son's wedding. Her son, by coincidence, is a very close friend of mine who I met in 2011, and he informed me a few months later that Bella Brodsky was his mother. But I was telling Bella this story 2 months ago at Sasha's wedding about Cameron Afzal in my final year here. I had and have a bit of a procrastination problem. And as I've just, it isn't just something that happens to you in college. You kind of are that way or you're not that way. And I remember him calling me in after a particularly late paper to tell me that he was afraid I was going to get into the real world and not know how to meet a deadline. That was the exact quote. So sometimes I think about the fact that I found a business where I have to meet a deadline every day. Look, I think I learned a lot about how to be a critical thinker here. I studied psychology, which has been vital, frankly, in terms of aspects of my job.
You didn't work at the Early Childhood Center, too.
And I worked at the Early Childhood Center. I had an experience, again, this is sort of the going against groupthink concept, and this is going to sound like a negative story, but it's not. I took Randall Keenan's class, I think my junior year, and time is a total blur to me, so I don't remember anything anymore, but I haven't slept through the night in a long time, but I did,
like conference week all the time, right?
I did. I wrote a short story, and we were assigned, I forget what they assigned, we all had to write a short story, and it was over a period of time, and it involved a lot of polishing and a lot of redrafting. And it had been, and then we presented it in the class, and I remember I was really proud of it, and I remember it was pretty roundly mocked by the other students in the class. And I was hurt, I was surprised. It was an important lesson that how you view something is not always going to be how it's received. But it was there was also an interesting sidebar with Professor Keenan, who said, he had wanted to tell the class this story is the closest to being published of any of yours. and that he didn't do it because he thought that it was going to sound like an insult. Things are not always what they seem. I mean, that is what I think about a lot when I think about my time here. You know, a regret is that I didn't keep living on campus. It probably would have been good because there was plenty of time to not live on a college campus after that. But I'm very grateful for the time that I had here. I'm very grateful to have been at a place that values teaching people critical thinking, that values helping you find your own voice, and to trust, you know, the voice in your head that is telling you something based on an instinct. I think that's what I learned here more than anything, and that is priceless.
So we have some current students in the audience. Advice you would give them?
Just enjoy it. I mean, honestly, it goes so fast. Everything that I said about trying to learn about people who are not like you holds. I mean, I cannot overstate the value of that. My children are in New York City public schools, and I don't think I would ever put them in private schools, and I went to a private high school. And I think it's important. When you are, don't pressure yourself to have a clear path immediately after Sarah Lawrence, although that's not something that Sarah Lawrence necessarily pushes you to do. But that's okay. That's okay. You will figure it out. That's my advice.
So I know there are people, I have the great privilege of these private conversations, which is lovely, but there are many of you who have questions, and Maggie has graciously said that she doesn't have any ground rules. She just might say she won't answer something if she can't. But
journalists
first,
can't have ground rules.
And so, all right, let's take a moment. There are a lot of hands up, so we will start with, oh, okay. Now my job just got really hard. So I will go, the first hand was up there. I'll go and we'll look and we'll try to capture you as best we can. So, yep.
You said there were 3 things that Trump was trying to do. You didn't mention dismantling the EPA, and I wondered why that is not risen to that level.
Well, I don't think he's dismantling the EPA. I think that he is, there's 2 things going on at the EPA. I mean, but deregulation is a massive story about this administration. I'm talking about this year right now. That's not a change. They've been doing that since day one, and that was one of the most fundamental pieces of 2017. But there are 2 congruent tracks involving the EPA, and one is the bizarre spectacle of Scott Pruitt and daily, stories about sending his taxpayer-funded security detail to go buy lotion, or mattresses from the Trump hotel. I mean, it sounds like an Onion headline, and then what is actually being done, and my fear, and this is my fear, frankly, for Trump administration coverage across the board, is there is so much focus on, your daily dose of Pruitt versus what is actually being done at the agency. And frankly, to answer further the question about what you can teach students to do, I mean, go deeper. I mean, every single time, go deeper. That is the main thing.
Question, there was one over here, right? Yep.
You mentioned the erosion of trusted institutions, and I'm curious if you feel like it's part of a concerted effort, like when you mentioned the nonsense about deep state or other people, just utter bullshit. Does it seem like that this is a direct attack? I mean, we've seen, history shows us that this can lead to the rise of fascism, or is this just a result of just unthinking, mental diarrhea that just comes out of
So that's a little bit of a complicated question. I think that the loss of faith in institutions began long before he took office. It goes back a while, but certainly the Iraq War did not help. And it didn't help both in terms of the media, and it didn't help in terms of institutional faith, or faith in institutions. We saw poll after poll that showed further erosion during the Obama era, particularly 2012 and going forward. Trump capitalized on that, right? I mean, during the election, you heard him talk about, this vote is rigged. Everything is zero sum with him. So your description of it aside on how it comes out of his mind, I mean, some of this is strategic. It's always very complicated. This was really hard during the campaign. Newspapers in particular are in the mindset of we need to declare what something is. It's either A or B. And sometimes it's not clear at all what it is with him. And so we were left with having to say it could be A or it could be B and not make a distinction or make a statement about it or declarative. So sometimes it's strategic. I know that he resisted using the term deep state for a long time because he thought it sounded too, quote unquote, cranky, as one former aide put it to me. As in he would be seen as a crank, or it was used by cranks. On the other hand, part of his strategy in 2016 was appealing to Ron Paul voters, and Ron Paul has promoted all kinds of conspiracy theories. He doesn't care. I mean, this is the part that I think people are missing. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about the consequences. He doesn't care about the first order consequences, the second order consequences, and he rarely thinks beyond the first order ones anyway. But if you said to him, don't you see this could be a problem? Literally his only view is this going to be a problem for me in some way? And if the sooner people understand that, the more this will all make sense. The net effect is that it is accelerating a lack of trust in institutions. And on the margins, and certainly with Republicans, and I suspect Republican-leaning independents, his constant attacks on law enforcement and the special counsel's probe are having an impact. People say, well, can't you guys just ignore him? He is the president of the United States. How are we supposed to ignore him? That is also not responsible. So I don't know if that's much of an answer, but that's my very complicated view of it.
There's been some debate about the role that Mike Pence is playing in the White House.
What's the debate?
It's diplomatic, but what is your take on the role that he will play in the
There was a great video the other day. I don't know how many of you saw this, the water bottle. There was this video of Trump and Pence at a meeting, and I forget what the meeting was, but Trump was doing it so that the shot could be clearer, because Trump thinks in visuals. He picked up his water bottle and he put it on the floor, and before it had even hit the floor, Mike Pence picked up his bottle and did the same thing. And it reminded me of this video in the campaign where they were waving to supporters. It was October 2016, and Trump was doing, he does this thing where it's and Pence started doing it right next to him. And so that is what Pence is doing. He is basically making himself sort of the unalloyed loyalist. At the same time, he has people who work for him who see him as the possible next president, and who know that there is a lack of planning, a lack of political strategy, a lack of cohesion within the White House, and they are good at it, so they are capitalizing on that. So that's what he's doing.
Right here.
Can't hear you.
Especially with having a young daughter. I mean, how...
Still can't hear.
Speak into the mic.
The question was, especially with a young daughter, how am I explaining this to her? It's a great question, and I don't have great answers. My daughter is incredibly bright. Her younger brother is incredibly bright, and her older brother is incredibly bright. And so they have a lot of questions about why it is that what Trump does, why Trump does what he does, why people aren't more bothered by it in certain respects, why, I don't have a great answer to that question. I explain it as best as I can, and mostly that this is a moment in time, and that this is a moment in time that we don't know where it will lead or how it will turn out, but that no matter how many negative things someone says in a position of power, that does not make it okay for you to do it. That's the best we can do.
I'm sort of making the range of the room. Yeah, here.
From the outside or from where I'm sitting, I really experience this as a critical moment that we're living history right now. And I expect that as a journalist, this was entirely unanticipated in terms of the relentlessness and extent of what's happening politically, and how unpredictable it is. And I wonder at sometimes what it's like to be that close to a fire, and what it's like to be a journalist reporting on this critical moment in U.S. history.
It's a thoughtful question, and I appreciate it. My answer is going to sound flip, and it's not. I try not to think about that aspect. I'm a very nervous flyer, and so if I don't remind myself that I'm 35,000 feet in the air, I can survive the flight. You know, this is our job, in all seriousness, and there are people who have much harder versions of my job than I do, right? War correspondents, people who are covering Syria, have a much harder job than I do. I wish that we all got more sleep, and I'm not saying that to be flip. I think that the risk for me in terms of the living history aspect of this is that we are all moving so fast and just chasing the ball down the court. I mean, one of the things that we're not stopping to look at the big picture. One of the things with him that is a huge challenge in a way that it really has not been with any other president. There has never been a president who has his obsession to stay in the news, because most presidents understand they're going to be there eventually, and most presidents don't feed off it the same way. He still wakes up thinking, how can I get myself in headlines? So think about the force multiplier that the presidency is on that kind of thinking. He has set the terms of engagement and debate much more than the media wants to admit. He has set the terms of debate and engagement for foreign leaders much more than they want to admit. I mean, look what happened with the G7. Yesterday, he made a statement that barely broke through, which I'm still a bit in shock over, that Russia should be admitted back into the G7, and that barely broke through. So I don't know that it's, what's frustrating to me is my fear that we're not capturing history properly, and I think about that all the time.
You and your colleagues from the Times and the Post are on MSNBC and CNN all of the time. Is there a downside to this for the papers, for the networks? What is the business strategy about this? Reporters like yourselves have been on TV as never before.
No, it's absolutely true, and it's a good question. I mean, for cable news networks, there's no downside. I mean, they get to put their imprimatur on newspaper reporting, and if anybody here watches cable news, you will know that cable news does not exist without newspaper headlines, because that's what drives what they do. Now, they often then take it and put their own sheen on it, but look, I became a CNN contributor in 2014, and I struggled with whether it was a good idea. I ultimately did do it because I found that it was a way to have my reporting reach more people. I think the downside or potential risk, I'll put it that way, is people need to be mindful, and I have messed up sometimes in this regard. You're not sitting around a kitchen table with your friends. And I mean, this is the risk with Twitter too, is that you are just, every moment is a potential opportunity for somebody to use against your work. So you just have to be very careful. I think that cable can give us a chance to further contextualize our stories, to talk about aspects of reporting that maybe got left on the cutting room floor, certainly in a way that you can't on Twitter. But we all do need to be mindful of that. It's a legitimate question.
I'm still having trouble getting my head around something you said. You said how...
I hear that a lot.
Yeah, so do I. You said how important it was that the media not be seen as taking sides. But so many people think the media are taking sides. If you're on the right, if you're on the left, you think it's Fox News and Sinclair Media, and etc. If you're on the left, if you're on the right, you think it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, this is part of the problem and part of the danger of a president who tries to make mainstream media outlets the opposition party, quote unquote, We are not the opposition party, and we cannot allow ourselves, he's baiting us when he does those things, and he's trying to get a reaction where we act as if we are the opposition party. And if you look at everyone's Twitter feeds, it works a fair amount of the time. We can't do, look, Fox News is its own animal. Fox News and sort of the choose your own adventure aspect of Fox News is, but I'm not being funny. If any of you want to understand people who don't agree with you, watch Fox News for 3 hours, and you will be, enlightened's not the right word, but you will have a real window. It's fundamentally different than what CNN and MSNBC do. MSNBC has more partisans on than CNN. And more partisans leading shows. CNN does, or tries to do, really just sort of straight news. But you're right that there is a perception issue, and all we can do is battle that perception with facts. I mean, I'm sure that many of you have seen the debate over using the word lies. There are a lot of readers who wish we would use it more. My editor-in-chief has spoken pretty definitively on this issue, on why he doesn't think it's a good idea. And I think he has a lot of very valid points, which is that it stops losing its meaning. So one of Donald Trump's things that he would do during the campaign, and the first time that I really realized the extent of it was November of 2015, and it's a long story as to why, but I mean, I remember sitting with sources from a conservative group, and I was explaining to them how frustrating covering him was. This is 2015. And they said, why? And I said, because he will point to this table and tell you it's a sofa. And he will not bend, no matter how many times you say, that's a table. Now, do people think that if I say lie, you're lying, that he's then going to say, you're right, I'm not telling the truth? That's not going to happen. So all we can do is present the facts. All we can do is show people this is what a person of power says, but this is the actual fact, and I hope that they will understand it. But I think that's the only way that we can combat that kind of concern.
You both have talked a lot about the importance of getting to know people who aren't like you, and I totally agree with that. But once you do that, rather than saying like, yay, I feel good about myself now, I can go home, what are concrete steps that you can take to change the conversation or change kind of people's willingness to listen?
I think that it's a great question. Oh, sure. The question was, after you engage in an act of civil discourse, how do you do more than just feel good about yourself and have it go ahead? I mean, it's a great question. But I mean, I think the only answer is continued acts, right? I mean, that's the next indicated thing, is just keep doing it. It's not like there's going to be some magic thing, and you also have to lower your expectations, because if the expectation is that you're going to convince the other person to think like you, I mean, so for instance, one of the big criticisms of Jeff Flake, the senator from Arizona, who has been one of Trump's longest standing critics. You will hear his liberal critics say, he says that Trump's terrible, but he votes with him every time. Now, there is certainly true that what Republicans could do is withhold votes, but on policy, he agrees with Trump more often than he doesn't. It's the rhetoric that he doesn't agree with. It is the coarseness of the discourse that he doesn't agree with. I think that people are going to have to realize that this is going to be a very long process and just keep doing the same things over and over.
I am wondering if you could address something about the executive orders that are coming in the form of an avalanche. I don't know a stronger word to describe them. Is there anything that is not possible for him, any category, it's not possible for him to try to rule by executive order now?
There are things that he can't do by executive order, but because I'm not certain what the specific parameters of what he can't do, I don't want to say more than I actually know. There are things that you cannot do by fiat. But look, Obama had a Republican Congress that would not do anything if it came from him, and so he started using executive orders to get around that. Trump is doing that to undo Obama's executive orders in a lot of cases. Not only, but in a lot of cases. On DACA and on the ACA, those are two big issues where this Congress is pretty mixed on whether they actually want to do things. Both on DACA, there are more people than you would think who would like a fix, but they are completely held captive by the more conservative members of their caucus. And the same thing is true on the ACA. There are a lot of voters in red states who like the ACA. There are a lot of poorer voters who now have health care. So there is a limit to what he can do. I don't actually think that they're coming in an avalanche anymore, but I do think that they are necessarily at a deeper pace than they were. But they are aimed at undoing what had come before. And this is what is unusual with Trump is the degree to which he is willing to undo previous policy by his immediate predecessor. We really don't usually see it this way.
I'm curious, just in terms of your career path, like what drew you to this work in the first place, what keeps you in it, and what do you most hope to achieve through your work?
I was not drawn to this work at all, which I hinted at, I guess, a bit before. I fell in love with the energy and pace of the New York Post newsroom in the 1990s. There was literally nowhere better to work in the city if you were in news. It was revitalized, and the Post understands the pulse of the city in a way that no other paper does. It just does. Because it fundamentally focuses on power. And I think that's part of what drew me to it, is trying to understand power and how it gets corrupted and abused. And that's part of what keeps me in it. I have no desire to live in Washington, but I have worked for Washington in one way or another for the last 8 years. I tend to look at things one day at a time. I don't tend to have a long arc of what I want to be. I don't have a 5-year plan. Like being alive is my 5-year plan. So I don't, and look, I mean, I would have said to you that what I wanted to accomplish was to help people understand who the 45th president is, but I've said nothing different over the course of the last 3 years than I've been saying from day one, and it's not really clear to me how many people I actually reached at all. So my goal is to keep trying.
You've spoken a lot about your feelings on like what the role of the media is, and also some stuff about like how Twitter isn't necessarily good for discourse and people's understanding of the news. And I was wondering what your opinion is on sort of like comedy news shows like, you know, like Stephen Colbert that in some ways increase like divisive thinking, but also reach a different audience sometimes than more serious, and don't have the same like mandate to fairness that sometimes just seems like it's for its own sake.
So I think that the best example of the best of that kind of show was Jon Stewart over many years, because I don't think that Jon Stewart was inherently mean-spirited. I think that Jon Stewart is an avid news consumer. He is also involved in activism in various ways, including helping 9/11 first responders over a lot of years. And I covered the aftermath of 9/11 for a long time. So for me, that resonates in a powerful way. And I think that Stewart became a necessary voice for people who felt that their own representatives had let them down during the course of the Iraq War and things that happened afterwards. I think what has happened since is, I think people pay less attention to the news than they used to. More people are getting their news from Stephen Colbert than they're getting from a newspaper than you would have said when Jon Stewart was in his prime, right, as a host. And I have a lot of respect for Stephen Colbert, so this is not singling him out. I thought Samantha Bee apologizing was strange. You didn't know that word was going to arouse some surprise. If you're going to say it, own it or don't do it or don't do it. But I think this thing that everybody has right now of demanding an apology all the time is a real problem. I think that it's complicated in the Trump era because so much of Trump's shtick is insulting people. And that was a lot of how he branded people during the campaign, right? Low energy Jeb, Lion Ted, Little Marco. And everyone laughs until he points his gun at them, and then it's really uncomfortable. I think that the difficulty for, I mean, it really is primarily Democrats who are doing this. I think the Democrats who are still candidly really struggling to figure out how to deal with him have decided to make comedians the tip of their spear, because they can break through and because they can insult and make people laugh and because everything has become about call and response. That's what Trump does and that's what comedians do. I'm not sure that Democrats, especially lawmakers, necessarily want to have to own everything a comedian says. And so I think that the spirit of some of these shows, not all of them, like I think Seth Meyers is like a genuinely like decent person. I don't think that he is looking to swing a bat. I think some people are, and I think that that is where it gets complicated.
Could you elaborate a little bit on why you chose public school for your children? I personally was a big believer in public schools. I went to Washington Irving High School, right by Garmersey Park, which sadly closed down. I learned about this when I was doing my thesis on U.S. public education reform, which I plan to send to that law. Theory that I believe that our public schools, which I find as one of the few remaining institutions in America, inclusion and diversity really looks like. But I feel like it's like sort of like this dying thing that's like charterization and corporatization and privatization of our schools. Could you talk a little about your thoughts on that? And also, if you could talk about gun violence and being from a parent to parent.
Yeah, I'd rather not actually answer that last question right now, if that's okay. In terms of the rest of it, look, I don't cover education, so I also don't want to venture too far out of my lane in terms of details. I don't know how much I chose public school versus public school chose me, because we could not afford tuitions at most of these schools. But that said, I was not eager to enroll my children in private schools. I graduated from Fieldston, which I attended from 7th grade through 12th grade, but I went to public school from K through 6, and I had a great education. And a really good, devoted education, and frankly, liked my teachers better in public school than I did in private school. I love my kids' teachers. I think that they are remarkable people. I think they are incredibly hardworking. I think that they understand my children's specific needs. I think they pay close attention. I think that private school, at minimum, helps add to that at this moment in time, given the disparity between the 1% and everyone else, can cloister more than it can help you understand other people.
Very bad.
You have a unique perspective and the opportunity to observe history in a way that the rest of us don't. And you're also the parent, as you described so well, of children. I wonder if you're willing to share your own take on this. Are you optimistic or are you terrified?
We don't do binaries, so.
That is a binary, so I think I'm not going to answer that. I think that, like anybody else, I think that I can see challenges ahead in various ways, and I think I am doing the best I can with my children.
And all the hands go up, all the way.
Can you speak about the potential demise of print media?
Well, we've been speaking about the potential demise of print media for a very long time, and to quote Elaine Stritch, as my dad would say, we're still here. So, look, Trump says this, and he's not wrong. Trump has been good for business. Trump has been, media is booming right now, and that is good. There was a very scary incident this week where DOJ, continuing an Obama policy, seized the phone records of one of my colleagues. And I don't want to get too far into that, but that is a dangerous place to go. To your question, look, I don't know what the model is going to be in 5 years. Digital is evolving so fast. But I really don't think that print media will ever be dead. What isn't going to end up happening? I mean, the death that concerns me is, the Times is fine. Local media is the real problem. And that I don't have a great answer for, and that scares me a lot. when you look at corruption flourishing in state houses, the death of local print outlets, it's a huge problem. So for that, I am very worried.
So Maggie, you have been incredibly gracious with us with your time. There's a soccer game happening today that I know there's some travel to. And you've traveled all over in your questions and answers. Any wrap-up thoughts you'd like to offer? Anything you want to, that you thought we would ask that we didn't?
No, I think you covered the gamut. For the students in the audience, don't think you're going to remember your way around campus when you come back. That would be my...
So we have a couple of things we'd just like to do. Mary, we are really grateful that you came. And this is swag from the admissions office. And I know that the Times may have product placement or CNN, but we